Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck. This is our 121st deck and it's titled Sous-Chef Etali. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is completely random, not suggested like some of our cards are, and this one is Ephemerate. So Ephemerate is 1 white for a instant that says exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has rebound. So if we cast it from our hand, we exile it, and at the beginning of our next upkeep, we may cast the card from exile without paying its mana cost. Now, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with Ephemerate. I knew we'd be doing something with blinking, and I figured we'd probably add some colors to it. And eventually I realized that there was one very specific thing that I personally wanted to do. And so our commander this week is going to allow us to do that thing, but it's not necessarily going to work with Ephemerate. And you'll see why in just a second, because our commander this week is Rocco Cabaretti Caterer. So Rocco is X red, green, white for a legendary creature, Elf Druid. He's a 3/1. When Rocco Cabaretti Caterer enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you may search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Now, if we're using Ephemerate, we're probably going to exile Rocco, bring him back into play. We would get his enter the battlefield trigger again, but because we're not casting it, we don't get to search for a creature, and even if we did, it would be mana value of 0 because 0 was in the X. So you might be wondering, why is Rocco here if he doesn't really help us with what we're trying to do? He doesn't help us with Ephemerate. And the reason for that is because he's technically the commander, but he's not the real commander. And as you may have guessed from the title of this video, there is a sous-chef in the deck, someone else that we're really trying to get. And in this case, that is Etali Primal Conqueror. So Etali Primal Conqueror is 5 red for a 7/7 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. It's got trample. When Etali Primal Conqueror enters the battlefield, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast any number of spells from among the non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Then it also has an ability for 9 and a Phyrexian green. We can transform it into Etali Primal Sickness, which is an 11/11 trample indestructible that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many poison counters. I'll be honest, we don't really care about the back side of Etali, we really want the front side, and the reason for that is because if we're casting spells for free from the top of everyone's library, which does include ours, we can hit cards like Ephemerate, which then exile Etali and bring it back into play, meaning we can do it again. So if we can keep exiling and flickering and blinking Etali as many times as possible, we can steal a ton of really powerful cards from our opponents, and then at the end of the day, we still have Etali Primal Sickness to lean back on if we need a way to actually close things out. So that is our commander for this week. And of course, we got to talk a little bit about the deck itself. So let's talk about some themes that we have going on and what we're really trying to do. So the first theme that we're going to talk a little bit about is going to be ramp. Because if you notice, Etali was 7 mana. To be able to cast that with Rocco, we need to cast Rocco for X equals 7, which means we need 10 total mana. That is a lot of mana to have in play at any given time, so we need to make sure that we are finding a ton of ways to make that happen. So we have cards like Elvish Rejuvenator, which is 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Druid. When Elvish Rejuvenator enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And I'm sure you may be able to put the pieces together, but we are specifically trying to use creatures that ramp like Elvish Rejuvenator instead of your traditional Cultivates and Kodama's Reaches, because we want to make sure that our blink effects and our exile effects like Ephemerate are putting in a little bit of extra work, because if we can blink Elvish Rejuvenator, we get the enter the battlefield effect again. So that's what we really want to be doing when we're ramping, and that's something that we couldn't do with instants and sorceries. So that is why Elvish Rejuvenator takes a spot instead of something like Cultivate. But that is only theme number 1. Theme number 2 is going to be all about the blink. That's where we want to be using our blink effects like Ephemerate. And a good example of that is Wisp Weaver Angel, which is 4 white for a 4/4 angel. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile another target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So that is going to be a great way for us to make sure that we are maybe exiling this with Etali, getting it back into play, exiling Etali again. But it's also just a 4/4 angel, so it's still going to be putting in a little bit of work. And if we can somehow blink Wispweaver Angel, say with Ephemerate, we're then ephemerating Wispweaver Angel, it will come back into play, it will exile something else, so we can kind of create a chain of effects that allow multiple creatures to leave and enter the battlefield at any given time. And then finally, that brings us to our last theme for the deck, which is of course creatures that enter the battlefield. We need to make sure that we have ways to survive to get all the way to Etali. Yeah, we can ramp with Elvish Rejuvenator and other cards like that, but we also want cards that just generate some value in what they're doing. And Spirited Companion is a great example of that, because Spirited Companion is 1 and a white for a 1/1 enchantment creature dog that simply says, when Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. And if we can just kind of keep accruing value by flickering Spirited Companion, which then draws us more cards, we flicker Elvish Rejuvenator, which gets us more lands, we flicker Wispweaver Angel, which flickers something else, we can really start to snowball and get to the point where our opponents can't deal with the value that we are presenting. So that is the major themes for our deck. That is what we're trying to do. And of course, we got to talk a little bit about some of our key cards. These are the cards that, while they may not necessarily be win conditions on their own, they're really going to help push us toward an eventual victory. So, the first of those is going to be Lae'zel's Acrobatics, which is 3 and a white for an instant that says exile all non-token creatures you control, then roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And if you roll a 10 through 20, return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control, then exile them again, return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So essentially, this pulls kind of double duty in this deck, because first off, it's blink. We want to be able to blink all of our creatures to get those enter the battlefield effects again, so that is great. Plus, it's one of the few cards that can actually blink our stuff twice just with the one card. Because if we roll a 10 to 20, we blink everything, it comes back, we do it again, then they come back at the next end step, so we essentially get to trigger all of our creatures 2 more times. But it's also super nice because it can protect us from board wipes. Because it exiles all of our creatures and returns them at the next end step, if someone goes to destroy all the creatures, we can cast this in response to save them and then bring them back at the end of the turn, so that way we still have a full board of creatures, and we're still getting the effects that trigger when they enter the battlefield. So Lae'zel's Acrobatics, definitely a sweet card and very, very good in this style of deck. And our next key card is going to be Warstorm Surge. So Warstorm Surge, 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So I would like to remind everybody that Etali is a 7/7 creature, which means that when Etali comes into play, we just get to do 7 damage to any target. That can kill creatures that are on our opponent's board, that can kill planeswalkers, that might be able to knock our opponents out of the game. But no matter what, if we have Warstorm Surge in play, and then we play Etali, and we can get maybe just a handful of exile effects, maybe say 3, we're still doing 21 damage to something, which can really start to close out the game, especially when people's life totals have gotten low throughout the course of, well, the rest of the game. So Warstorm Surge is a huge win condition in this deck, and it really puts in a lot of work for what we're trying to do. Our final key card, though, is going to be Feather the Redeemed. Very different than the first two, but Feather the Redeemed is red, white, white for a 3/4 angel with flying. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature you control, exile that card instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. If you do, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So Lae'zel's Acrobatics exiles our entire board, but most of our exile effects are going to be single target. They're going to target one specific creature, we exile it, bring it back, and that's it, the spell's gone. But with Feather, we can rebuy that spell. So if we're using Ephemerate to exile Etali, we can say, instead of exiling it with Rebound or using it the second time, put it back into exile with Feather, then return it to our hand, meaning we can continue to use these spells over and over and over again and keep getting value over and over and over again. So Feather really is a pretty scary creature. There's a good chance that your opponents will try to kill it as soon as it hits the board, because Feather is just incredibly difficult to stop once it gets going. But that makes it very powerful in a deck that cares about targeting our creatures. So I do think Feather earns a spot in the key cards, but I understand that your opponents will probably try to deal with it very, very quickly. But with that out of the way, let's move on to our cool interactions, talk a little bit about some cards that I think synergize either very well together or are cards that I just want to highlight because I think they work in unique and creative ways. So the first of our cool interactions is between Emil the Blessed and Dual Caster Mage. Now, normally, if you're playing a Naya colored deck, you don't really have a way to interact with the stack super well. And so for that reason, I tend to put Dual Caster Mage or cards like Reverberate into my decks quite a bit because they copy an instant or sorcery. So if someone tries to counterspell something, you can just copy it and then counterspell their counterspell. So I think that's a super unique way of doing it. So that way we are, of course, including Dual Caster Mage, which is 1 red for a 2/2 with flash. When Dual Caster Mage enters the battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery, you may choose new targets for the copy. So that's great, especially if we're exiling our own spells. Being able to rebuy Dual Caster Mage is super useful. But we also want to make sure that we have ways to kind of keep doing it without the use of spells, kind of holding that up even if we don't have any cards in our hand. And that is where Emil the Blessed comes in, because Emil is 2 white for a 4/4 unicorn, and you can pay 3, exile another target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay a green or a white. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on it. If it was a unicorn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead. So Emil can allow us for 3 mana to reuse our Dual Caster Mage even if we have no cards in our hand. So if someone tries to maybe counterspell something because we just cast the last spell in our hand or our commander, we can make sure that we use Dual Caster Mage to stop it. We can use it to copy someone else's ramp effects. We can use it to copy someone else's removal effects. Dual Caster Mage really pulls a lot of work in this, and because Dual Caster Mage in its own unique way can copy blink effects, we can then blink Dual Caster Mage with the copied blink effects, which then copies the original. There are ways to go infinite with that. I specifically tried not to build in too many, but Dual Caster Mage is incredibly powerful, so there is a chance that there are infinites in here. Just, be aware of that as you're playing. But that is cool interaction number 1. We, of course, have one more cool interaction to talk about, and this one is between Restoration Angel and Felidar Guardian. So Restoration Angel is 3 and a white for a 3/4 angel with flash, flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-angel creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. On the other hand, we have Felidar Guardian, which is also 3 and a white for a 1/4 cat beast. When Felidar Guardian enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If you notice, these two cards actually do go infinite with each other. Restoration Angel comes in, exiles Felidar Guardian comes back, exiles Restoration Angel, which comes back, exiles the Guardian, and they can just infinitely exile each other over and over and over and over. Normally, that's not enough to win the game, right? But it is something to be aware of, because if you have something like Warstorm Surge in play, it does actually win the game because they keep doing that damage to your opponents. So this is a way to go infinite. It does need a third piece to actually win the game, but it is worth mentioning that they can just continuously exile each other, because it doesn't seem super, easy to understand right off the bat. So I thought that would be good to mention. But those are all of our cool interactions. And finally, we get to the part of the deck tech that people tend to be the most interested in. This is, of course, a budget show, so we've got to talk about our budget. And this week, our total deck price came in at $93.19, with our most expensive card being Conjurer's Closet at $8.45. And Conjurer's Closet is 5 mana for an artifact. that says at the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this is just a free flicker effect every single turn, which is great. That's exactly what we want to be doing in this deck. But like I said, it is a massive $8.45. So if you do need to trim the price, cut it down to about $85 for the total deck, you could cut out Conjurer's Closet. It doesn't really synergize with a lot of our cards because we want to be rebuying instants and sorceries, and we kind of want to just be able to exile things immediately. Conjurer's Closet doesn't do that, but it is still very powerful, so I do think it's worth the include. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to actually increase the power and the price of this deck, I have two cards to recommend for cards that are a little bit outside of my budget, but might not necessarily be outside of yours. And of course, we got to talk about what those cards would replace in the deck. So first up, we have a brand new upgrade to talk about, and that is Gandalf the White, which can come in to replace Far Traveler. So first up, Gandalf the White, of course, is 3 white for a 4/5 legendary creature avatar wizard. He's got flash. You may cast legendary spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. If a legendary permanent or an artifact entering or leaving the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So in other words, when Etali enters the battlefield, we get to do the exile effect twice. When Rocco enters the battlefield, we get to do his search effect twice. This doesn't hit a ton of creatures in our deck, but the ones that it does hit are incredibly important and are almost always going to be the win conditions. So I think Gandalf the White definitely deserves a spot in the deck if you're able to squeeze it in, but it is a huge $9.91, so that is definitely outside of our budget range. And if you do decide to put it in, though, I would recommend you cut Far Traveler, which is 2 and a white for a legendary enchantment. Background, commander creatures you own have, at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target tapped creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Most of the time, we're not really going to cast Rocco until we're ready to win the game. And even once we do, we really want to be exiling Etali, and so we're not going to have the time to attack with Etali and then exile it at the end of turn once it's tapped. So Far Traveler can be very good in the early game, but in the early game we don't really have Rocco, and in the late game we're not really attacking until we're ready to win, so it doesn't do quite as much as I was hoping it would do when I first put it into the deck. I do, though, still have one more out-of-budget upgrade that I would suggest for you, and this one is very similar to Gandalf the White. It's also a pretty recent card. This one is, of course, Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. So, Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, 4 and a white for a 4/7 Phyrexian Praetor. She's got Vigilance. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So, once again, double the Etali. And permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities or permanents your opponents control to trigger. That's just a little bit of icing on the top of the cake. We don't necessarily need that, or honestly even want that necessarily, but it's going to be relevant for us, maybe just to shut down what our opponents are doing. On the other hand, if you're looking to take the card out, I would recommend Faldorn Dreadwolf Herald, who is 1 red-green for a 3/3 legendary creature human druid. Whenever you cast a spell from exile or a land enters the battlefield under your control from exile, make a 2/2 green wolf creature token, and pay 1, tap, discard a card, exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. The only card that really actually casts spells from exile in this deck is going to be Etali, and while that does cast 4 spells a turn, so we would make 4 2/2 wolves, it only works with Etali. So if we have Faldorn in play and any of our other blink effects or any of our other enter the battlefield effects, it doesn't actually do anything. So I don't think it's worth putting a card in that only synergizes with Etali, because I mean, it doesn't even synergize with Rocco, doesn't synergize with anything else we're doing. So I don't think that's going to be quite good enough, but that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It's still a good card. I just think Elesh Norn's going to be a bit better. So those are our out-of-budget upgrade sections, and of course, we got to see how this deck performs in a game. But before we get to the game, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel. Reach out to us, let us know how things are going, and of course, like I said, support everything that we're doing over here at the Dungeon Learner's Guide. So first up, you can find us on Twitter at 13POYNZ. You can find us on Reddit, u/POYNZ13. You can send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. Those are all great ways to reach out if you ever have any questions, if you want to suggest cards to be turned into decks for the channel eventually. Those are all great ways to do it. Other than that, if you're looking to support the channel, other than, of course, liking the videos and subscribing to the channel, which is the best way that you can help support us, you can also find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, where you can join the 8 people listed below, the amazing people down there, as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, and Devin Purser. To the 8 of you all, thank you so much for all of your support. And if you're wondering what they get for supporting us over on Patreon, they actually get access to the decks an entire week early. They get access to a Discord channel where they help brew up some of the decks and also play the games. So if you want to be in a game on this channel, that is the first place I look. They also get the unedited gameplay videos. They get the guarantee from me that any cards they suggest will be turned into videos eventually. And of course, at the highest tier of the Patreon, you also get a random card sent to you from me every single month. It will be one of the cards that we build around, but I do decide those completely at random, so even I don't really know what you're getting sometimes. And then you may notice, if you're a longtime watcher of this channel, that there is a new link here on this page because our Dungeon Learners Guide channel has officially reached the point where we can have channel members. So if you are interested in supporting us here on YouTube, you can find us, you can join us as a channel member, you can give us those super likes, I think that's what they're called. I'm still new to this, so please let me know. I will make sure to put the link to that in the description of the video if that is something you are interested in, but I tried to structure it in a very similar way to the Patreon, so if you like the things that you could get from the Patreon, you can also get those now for being a channel member. So thank you all so much to anyone who is looking to join in. Thank you all so much for everyone who has watched so far. And I think with all of that being said, why don't we see how this deck performs in a game? So we are going to run our Sous-Chef Etali deck up against 3 opponents this week. This week we are playing against Shawn, who is running Ashcoat of the Shadow Swarm, Cow, who is playing Brina, the Demagogue, and Bilal playing Obeka, Brute Chronologist. So starting with Shawn and his Ashcoat of the Shadow Swarm deck, this is, as you may be able to guess, a rat deck. He specifically built it as a rat colony deck, so he wants to play as many rat colonies as quickly as possible, and then use Ashcoat to make them even bigger, essentially doubling the plus they get from themselves, and just kind of run people over. I have played against this deck multiple times, and every single time it comes down, it is incredibly terrifying. Ashcoat is very, very strong for what it does, and it's probably a good thing that Ashcoat actually deals with rats, which is a pretty under-supported creature type in Magic, because I think if it dealt with something like dragons or goblins, it would be an absolute menace to try to deal with. So even though, like I said, rat's not super supported, it's still an incredibly powerful deck, and I am definitely concerned about it going into this game. Next up, we have Cow and his Brina deck, and this is definitely a, I don't necessarily want to say politics deck, because Cow is not big on politics, but it's more of making sure that his opponents don't attack him, trying to give incentives for his opponents to attack each other, maybe trying to give reasons to send a big creature or their commander somewhere else rather than a Cow. And I've played against quite a few Brina decks in the past, and I think even without really looking at too many other commanders, I usually take a lot of notice when Brina's at the table, because Brina is very good at kind of tricking you into doing what she wants. And hopefully we can stay away from that in this game, but we'll see. I think out of all these commanders, this is probably the one that I'm the most concerned about, but we will see how it goes. And then finally, we have Bilal playing Obeka, Brute Chronologist. And Obeka is, again, a very powerful commander. Being able to end the turn is very useful when it comes to cards that have like negative downsides at the end of turn, or maybe extra turn spells that say at the end of your turn you lose the game. So I imagine Obeka is going to be taking a bunch of extra turns and dealing with a lot of creatures and enchantments and artifacts that have downsides. But because of Obeka, I imagine Bilal's going to be able to get around them somehow. So I'm very interested to see how this goes. And we've actually also done an Obeka deck on the channel before, so if you are interested, please do check that out. I will make sure to link it. But with all of that being said, let me know in the comments which of these commanders you think is going to be the most difficult for us to face, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Cow, and then Bilal. On my first turn, I play a Path of Ancestry. Shawn plays a Crypt of Agadeem. Cow plays a Plains. Bilal plays a Sunken Hollow. I play a Jungle Shrine. Shawn plays a Swamp, then casts a Rat Colony, which gets +1/+0 for each other rat he controls. Cow plays a Swamp and casts Mind Stone. Bilal plays a Mountain. I play a Plains and cast Feather the Redeemed, letting me return any instant or sorcery to my hand at the end of turn if it targets one of my creatures. Shawn plays a Swamp, then casts a Soul Ring, and this lets him cast 2 more Rat Colonies, then he moves to combat and attacks me for 4 with the non-summoning sick Rat Colony. Cow plays an Idyllic Grange and casts his commander Brina the Demagogue, allowing any player to draw a card if they attack one of his opponents with lower life than another opponent, while Cow also gets to put 2 +1/+1 counters on one of his creatures. Bilal plays an island and casts Fractured Power Stone. I play a Plains and cast Solemn Simulacrum, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. I then attack Shawn for 3 with Feather, triggering Brina, so I draw a card, and Cow puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his commander. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Lightning Greaves, then casts his commander Ashcoat of the Shadow Swarm, giving his other rats +X/+X whenever he attacks, where X is the number of rats he controls, also letting him mill 4 in his end step and return 2 rats from his graveyard to his hand. He immediately equips Ashcoat with the Lightning Greaves, giving him haste and shroud, then attacks Bilal with his entire board, triggering Ashcoat and Brina, giving Shawn's rat colonies a total of +7/+4, drawing him a card, and letting Cow put 2 more counters on Brina. Then Bilal takes a total of 30 damage, and at the end of turn, Shawn mills 4, returning a rat colony from his graveyard to his hand. On Cow's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking Shawn with Brina, triggering herself, drawing Cow a card, putting 2 more +1/+1 counters on Brina, doing 7 total damage. Then, in his second main phase, Cow casts Knight of the White Orchid, searching his library for a Plains and putting it into play since an opponent controls more lands than him. He then plays Miko Koro, Center of the Sea, and passes. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Fury for its evoke cost, exiling Delina Wildmage from his hand instead of paying mana. This comes in and does 1 damage to Shawn and to each of Shawn's rat colonies, killing them, then the Fury is sacrificed. After that, Bilal casts his commander Obeka Brute Chronologist, letting him tap her to have the player whose turn it is choose to end the turn. On my turn, I cast Acrobatic Maneuver, exiling Solemn Simulacrum, returning it to play under my control, drawing a card, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, then returning the Acrobatic Maneuver to my hand at the end of turn. On Shawn's turn, he casts Bolas's Citadel, allowing him to play the top card of his library, spending life rather than mana to cast it. This lets him pay 2 life to cast a rat colony, but in response, Cow casts Utter End, exiling Bolas's Citadel. After that resolves, Shawn plays a Swamp, then moves the Lightning Greaves to the new rat colony, giving it haste and shroud. He moves to combat, attacking Cow with the colony and me with Ashcoat, giving his other rats +2/+2 and triggering Brina, so Shawn draws a card while Cow puts 2 counters on his knight. This allows Cow to block the colony, killing it with first strike and taking no damage, while I take the 3 from Ashcoat. In his second main phase, Shawn re-equips Ashcoat with the Greaves, giving him haste and shroud, then mills 4 cards and returns a rat colony and crypt rats from his graveyard to his hand. On Cow's turn, he plays a Swamp, then casts Duelist's Heritage, letting him give any 1 creature double strike whenever it attacks, and also casts Combat Calligrapher, allowing any player who attacks one of Cow's opponents to create a 2/1 Inkling token that is also tapped and attacking. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal with Brina and me with the Knight. He gives Brina double strike, triggers his commander, drawing a card, putting 2 counters on the Knight, and also creating 2 Inkling tokens, one attacking Shawn and the other attacking me. I block the Inkling with Feather and the Knight with Solemn, but before damage, I also cast Liberate, exiling the Solemn and returning it to play at the end of turn, searching my library for another basic land, putting it into play, then also returning Liberate to my hand at the end of turn. Then damage finally happens, with me taking nothing, killing an Inkling, while Bilal takes 16 and is knocked out of the game. On my turn, I cast a Druid of the Emerald Grove, rolling a d20 when it enters and searching my library for 2 basic lands. Then, since I rolled a 5, I put both of the lands into my hand, but I do still get to play the mountain that I searched for a turn. Shawn plays a swamp and casts 3 rat colonies and equipped rats, which allows him to pay X mana to do X damage to each creature, then equips Lightning Greaves to a rat colony, giving it haste and shroud. He moves to combat, attacking me with Ashcoat for 3 and Cow with a rat colony for 11. This triggers Brina, letting Shawn draw a card and make an Inkling, also attacking me, while Cow puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his Inkling and uses Duelist Heritage to give Ashcoat double strike. Then I block the Inkling with Feather, killing the token, and I block Ashcoat with Solemn, killing the construct and drawing me a card while Cow takes 11 damage. On Cow's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking Shawn for 3 with the Calligrapher and me for 11 with Brina and the Inkling, giving the Inkling double strike, creating an Inkling token attacking each of his opponents, triggering Brina, drawing a card and putting 2 counters on Brina. Before blocks, I cast Generous Gift, destroying Brina and letting Cow make a 3/3 elephant token. Then I block the new Inkling with Feather, killing it, taking 8 damage while Shawn takes 5. Then in Cow's second main phase, he casts Read the Bones, scrying 2, drawing 2, and losing 2 life. On my turn, I play a Plains and cast Guardian of Girapur, exiling the Druid and returning it to play at the beginning of the next end step. I then also cast Pegasus Guardian, which creates a 1/1 Pegasus token in my end step if a creature I controlled left the battlefield this turn. Then I move to my end step, making a Pegasus token and returning Druid of the Emerald Grove to the battlefield, searching my library for 2 basic lands, rolling a 1 on a d20 so they both go to my hand. On Shawn's turn, he casts Black Market, putting a counter on it whenever a creature dies, and creating black mana equal to the counters on it at the beginning of his first main phase. He then re-equips the Lightning Greaves to Crypt Rats, giving them haste and shroud, attacks me with his rat colonies and Ashcoat for 26 total damage, making an Inkling, getting double strike on Ashcoat, and triggering Brina, so Shawn draws a card while Cow puts 2 +1/+1 counters on an Inkling. I block the colonies with the Guardian, Druid, and Pegasus, killing them all, block the Inkling with Feather, killing the token, then I take 6 from Ashcoat while Shawn puts 4 counters on Black Market. Second main phase, Shawn activates Crypt Rats for X equals 6, doing 6 damage to each creature and player, completely wiping the board and putting 12 more counters on Black Market. On Cow's turn, he plays a Caves of Koilos and then recasts his commander Brina. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast my commander Rocco Cabaretti Caterer for X equals 7, searching my library for a creature that costs 7 or less, putting it into play. This lets me get Etali Primal Conqueror, exiling cards from each player's libraries until they exile a non-land card, letting me cast it for free. Once Etali resolves, I'm able to cast Shawn's Piper of the Swarm, Cow's Citadel Siege, choosing cons, so I tap an opponent's creature at the beginning of each combat, and my own Restoration Angel, letting me exile Etali and return him to play, repeating this process. The second time Etali's trigger resolves, I get to cast Shawn's Phyrexian Arena, drawing a card and losing a life in my upkeep, Cow's Ambitious Cost, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life, and my Farhaven Elf, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. On Shawn's turn, he casts 3 rat colonies and his commander Ashcoat. He equips Ashcoat with the Lightning Greaves, giving him haste and shroud. Then at the end of turn, he mills 4, returning Nashi, Moonsage's Scion, and Crypt Rats from his graveyard to his hand. On Cow's turn, he casts Tragic Arrogance, choosing a creature, enchantment, artifact, and planeswalker for each player, forcing everyone to sacrifice the rest. This winds up destroying everything except Farhaven Elf, Phyrexian Arena, a rat colony, Black Market, Soul Ring, Mindstone, Duelist Heritage, and Brina, putting 7 more counters on Black Market. He then attacks Shawn with Brina, triggering herself, letting Cow draw a card, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Brina, and giving her double strike, hitting Shawn for 6 total damage. Then in his second main phase, he plays a Myriad Landscape. In my upkeep, I draw an extra card and lose a life, then recast my commander Rocco, this time for 6, searching my library for Ulvenwald Hydra, putting it into play. When the Hydra enters, I search my library again, this time for a land, specifically a Selesnya Sanctuary, putting it into play tapped and returning a forest to my hand. Then I attack Cow for 1 with the Farhaven Elf, and in my second main phase, play a Guildless Commons, returning a Plains to my hand. Shawn once again recasts his commander Ashcoat, then also recasts a rat colony and crypt rats. He attacks Cow for 5 with a rat colony, but before damage, he ninjutsus in Nashi Moonsage's Scion, doing 3 damage and exiling the top card of each player's library, being able to play one of them and spend life to cast it rather than mana. Since he only has 2 lands and a Far Traveler, he opts not to play any of them, then casts another rat colony. Cow plays a swamp, and before he can move to combat, Shawn spends 5 mana for Crypt Rats, doing 5 damage to each creature and player, destroying every creature on the board except for the Hydra, putting 6 counters on Black Market. In Cow's second main phase, he casts Devastating Mastery for its student cost, letting Shawn return Sol Ring and Black Market to his hand, then destroying each other non-land permanent. Once that resolves, he casts Nil's Disciplined Enforcer, putting a +1/+1 counter on 1 creature for each player in their end step, then making his opponents pay a mana for each counter on a creature that attacks him. On my turn, I cast Warstorm Surge, doing damage to any target equal to the power of any creature that enters under my control. I then cast Avenger of Zendikar, creating 11 0/1 plant tokens since I control 11 lands, putting a +1/+1 counter on all my plants whenever a land enters under my control, also doing 5 damage to Nils, killing him. Once that's resolved, I play a Forest, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of my plants. Shawn, once again, recasts his commander Ashcoat, then recasts his Sol Ring, and casts 2 more rat colonies plus Marrow-Gnawer, giving all his rats fear. Then at the end of turn, he mills 4 cards, returning Nashi and Crypt Rats from his graveyard to his hand. On Cow's turn, he casts his own Sol Ring, then casts Cunning Rhetoric, allowing him to exile the top card of an opponent's library when they attack him, being able to play the exiled card. He also casts Archfiend of Depravity, forcing each player to sacrifice all but 2 of their creatures in their end step. On my turn, I cast Wispweaver Angel, exiling Avenger of Zendikar when it enters the battlefield, returning it to play under my control. This has me doing 9 damage to Cow and creating 12 more plant tokens. In response though, Cow flashes in Selfless Squire, preventing all damage that would be dealt to him this turn, and putting that many +1/+1 counters on the Squire, so it gets 9 counters. I then play a Plains, putting a +1/+1 counter on all my plants, and attacks Shawn with 11 plants for 22 total damage, so even though he blocks as much as he can, he still takes lethal damage, getting knocked out of the game. Then in my end step, the Archfiend makes me sacrifice all my creatures except the Avenger and the Angel. On Cow's turn, he casts Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards, then casts Cruel Entertainment, taking control of my next turn while I take control of his next turn. Knowing he'll be able to win the game using my own Warstorm Surge, I respond by casting Return of the Wild Speaker, drawing 5 cards since I control a creature with 5 power. This finds me the cards I need to win the game by casting Justicar's Portal, exiling my Angel and returning it to play, which also exiles the Avenger, returning it to play, making me 13 more plants and doing 9 damage to Cow. Then I also cast Otherworldly Journey, exiling the Angel and returning it to play in the next end step, doing another 4 damage to Cow. Unfortunately though, I completely forget that Cow hasn't gone to combat yet, so now, with my blocker out of the way, he simply attacks me for 5 with the Archfiend, knocking me out, and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. I'm still kicking myself a little bit for my mistake right at the end of the game. We definitely could have, and honestly should have won. We were in a winning position, and if I had just waited to cast that second exile effect on the Angel, or honestly even cast it just on the Avenger instead, we would have won the game, so that is my own mistake, but you live and you learn, and I am very happy to see Cow win the game because Brina, like I predicted, very terrifying, did a great job of kind of forcing his opponents to keep attacking other people, which is exactly what Brina wants to do. And, you know, being able to draw cards is great, but that means you're not hitting the Brina player, which is not what you want to be doing in that situation. So very, very cool. Bilal, unfortunately, we didn't get to see too much from his deck. He really died pretty early on and didn't do too much. So I'm hoping that in the future, when he brings his Obeka deck back, we'll be able to see a little bit more from it. Shawn and his rats really played the aggressive strategy in this game. He was definitely the one putting the pressure on people's life totals very early on, hitting Bilal for a massive 30 damage. And I know you didn't really see it too much in my narration, but when Shawn was on that turn deciding who he was going to attack, Bilal told him that if he attacked Bilal, then Bilal would wipe his board. So of course, Shawn's got to call him on that one and send everything his way. So definitely a very cool deck, definitely a very scary deck. The rats can get very big very, very quickly. And then, of course, we got to talk about our deck. I'm very happy with how this deck performed. Seeing a lot of the ramp creatures that you don't normally see, like the Druid of the Emerald Grove, was super, super cool. And it was nice to be able to actually get Etali in play. Didn't get to last too long. We only got to exile it twice, but still very, very sweet. And definitely a deck that is up my alley in terms of things I like to play. So let me know in the comments if there's anything that you think we should change about the deck, cards to include, cards to remove, but overall, just let me know what you think. I'd love to hear everyone's comments and thoughts. So I hope you all enjoyed it. I know I certainly did, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.